Before we begin, I need to extend an invitation to you. If you enjoy dark, mysterious stories that will mess with your mind, subscribe to the channel now, because what you're about to hear today is no ordinary story. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I like to imagine how far these stories are going, and who's on the other side, ready to dive into this kind of narrative. The castle stood isolated among arid hills in the American heartland, a structure too old to belong to that century, as if it had been displaced from another time and abandoned there by mistake. Its narrow towers pierced the grey sky, and the windows, always closed, seemed to silently observe anyone who dared to approach. The road leading to it was little used, covered in cracks and dry undergrowth, as if the earth itself had decided to forget that place. For decades, the castle was associated with a name that still circulated in whispers: Countess Eleanor Whitmore. Wealthy, reserved, and shrouded in mystery, she had arrived in the region years before, buying the property without public negotiations and initiating renovations that transformed the place into something even more imposing and unsettling. Workers came and went, but few stayed for long. Some claimed sudden illnesses. Others simply disappeared from the city without warning. In the eyes of the local population, Eleanor was not merely eccentric. There was something about her presence that caused immediate unease. Always dressed in black with a rigid posture and a gaze too fixed to be considered normal, she seemed to see beyond people, as if constantly assessing something invisible. Yet she maintained an impeccable routine. Private events, frequent deliveries during the early hours of the morning, and rare visits, always from individuals who were not recognized by anyone in the region. The antagonism didn't stem from direct confrontations, but from the growing unease it provoked, and it was precisely this unease that caught Daniel Harper's attention. Daniel was an investigative journalist who had built his career exploring forgotten stories, cold cases, ignored accounts, events that seemed inexplicable, but at their core concealed something far more concrete. Unlike Eleanor, his life was exposed, chaotic, and marked by a constant obsession with answers. Where many saw coincidence, he saw patterns. Where there was silence, he suspected concealment. The story of the castle reached him as a fragment, an old note lost in a local newspaper, mentioning a domestic incident that occurred years ago involving the Countess. The most intriguing detail was not the event itself, but the absence of information. No victim's name, no detailed police report, no public investigation. Just a brief comment and the abrupt closure of the case. This was unusual, and Daniel knew it. He arrived in the city at the beginning of winter, when activity was naturally reduced and people were less inclined to talk. Even so, a few questions were enough to realize that the castle wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a blind spot in the collective memory. Whenever he mentioned Eleanor or the incident, the answers were vague, evasive, or simply non-existent. But the most revealing behavior wasn't in the words, but in the reactions. Avoided glances, prolonged silences, abrupt changes of subject. It was as if everyone knew something, but had decided collectively not to bring it up again. For Daniel, this was sufficient confirmation that something was buried there. Unable to access consistent official records, he decided to follow the only remaining path: the castle itself. The property had technically been abandoned since Eleanor's disappearance, which occurred shortly after the incident. No heir appeared, no sale was made. The place simply remained closed, untouched, and avoided. On the night he decided to approach, the wind cut through the hills with force, producing a constant sound that seemed to echo off the stone structures. Daniel parked his car a safe distance away and continued on foot, carrying only a flashlight, a recorder, and his camera. As he moved forward, something began to bother him. Not fear exactly, but a feeling of unease. The silence around him was unnatural. There were no insects, no movement, not even the distant sound of animals. It was as if that space were isolated from the rest of the world. When he finally reached the rusty gate, he realized it was ajar. That didn't make sense. The castle should have been sealed off years ago. Still, the gate yielded easily to the touch, creaking slowly, almost draggingly. Daniel hesitated for a moment, assessing the situation, but his nature did not allow him to back down in the face of something inexplicable. He went in. The path to the main entrance was lined with partially destroyed statues, covered in moss and with deep cracks. Some of them seemed to have been deliberately damaged, as if someone had tried to erase faces, identities. The main door was closed, but not locked. When she pushed it, an old smell filled the air, a mixture of damp wood, accumulated dust, and something else difficult to identify. Something organic. The interior of the castle remained surprisingly intact. Furniture covered with sheets, paintings still hanging, long corridors that disappeared into the darkness. Nothing indicated sudden abandonment, but there were also no clear signs of extreme deterioration. It was as if time had stopped in there. Daniel began recording everything with his camera, moving slowly, attentive to any detail out of place. And it was then that he found the first element that would completely change the course of his investigation. On the floor of the great main hall, almost imperceptible beneath the layer of dust, there was a dark stain. It wasn't ordinary dirt. The irregular shape, the color deeply ingrained in the wood. It was ancient, very ancient. And yet, it seemed too recent for a place that had been abandoned for so many years. As Daniel approached, he noticed something even more disturbing, marks around the stain, as if something heavy had been dragged from there towards the side corridor. He didn't need confirmation to understand what that suggested. The domestic incident had not been an accident, and the castle wasn't as empty as everyone believed. A dry sound echoed from the upper floor. It wasn't the wind. Daniel froze for a second, his breath caught, his eyes fixed on the staircase in front of him. Then slowly he raised the lantern, and he decided to go up. The castle's interior revealed more than abandonment. It exposed a routine abruptly interrupted, but not chaotically. Each object seemed to have been left exactly where it should be, as if someone had left with the intention of returning shortly afterward. The accumulated dust created a uniform layer over furniture and surfaces, but in some specific spots it was disturbed, as if something or someone had recently passed through there. Daniel climbed the stairs with measured steps, avoiding the most noticeable creaking of the treads. The wood, despite its age, still supported his weight firmly. Upon reaching the second floor, he noticed that the main corridor split into two wings. To the right, closed and aligned doors, possibly bedrooms. To the left, a larger space, where the architecture suggested common rooms or private areas. He chose the left wing. With each step, details began to emerge. Old portraits on the walls, all with heavy frames and refined finishes. Most depicted unknown figures, men and women with rigid expressions, dressed in clothing from different eras. But there was a disturbing pattern: the eyes. In virtually every picture, the eyes appeared to have been scraped or damaged, as if someone had deliberately removed that specific part. Daniel stopped before one of the larger portraits. The central figure was a woman of imposing posture, dressed in black, with details that indicated high status. Even with her face partially damaged, it was possible to recognize the features described in the old accounts. Eleanor Whitmore. The painting had been violated in the same way as the others. The eyes were destroyed. That didn't seem like ordinary vandalism. There was intent, repetition, an almost ritualistic pattern. Moving forward, Daniel found a door that was ajar. Unlike the others, this one wasn't completely sealed by time. When he pushed it open, it revealed an office. The atmosphere contrasted sharply with the rest of the castle. There was organization. Books were neatly lined up, documents stacked with precision, a central table still functional. The chair, slightly pushed aside, indicated recent use, or at the very least, not as distant as the rest of the property suggested. He approached the table. The papers found there were not ordinary records. There were detailed, handwritten notes, many of them repeating names, dates, and symbols that didn't make immediate sense. Some passages were crossed out with excessive force, as if the writer had tried to erase ideas or correct something that shouldn't have been recorded. Among the documents, one caught his attention. It was an employee register. Names listed with check-in dates, and in many cases, no checkout date. Daniel frowned. That confirmed the town's reports. People who came to work at the castle and simply disappeared from local life. But there, on paper, was no mention of dismissals, transfers, or justifications. Just absence. He continued flipping through until he found something even more disturbing. Personal notes attributed to Eleanor herself. The writing was firm, controlled, but laden with an evident obsession. They weren't emotional reflections, but observational records, as if she were studying something, or someone. The texts mentioned behaviors, physical reactions, resistance, and response patterns. There were no full names, only initials, and they were always accompanied by dates that coincided with the entries of previously registered employees. That wasn't household management, it was monitoring. Daniel took a step back, processing the information. The castle wasn't just a place to live, it was a controlled environment, a space where people entered and officially ceased to exist. Before I could delve deeper into the analysis, a noise echoed again from the upper floor, closer this time. Steps, slow, irregular, dragging. Daniel instinctively turned off the flashlight, plunging the room into twilight. His body reacted before his mind, seeking absolute silence. The sound came from the hallway. Someone, or something, was there. The footsteps ceased for a few seconds, creating an uncomfortable pause. Then a faint scratching sound ran along the wooden exterior wall, like fingernails or some rigid object being pressed against the surface. Daniel remained motionless. Instinct told him to retreat, but logic screamed that this was the decisive moment in the investigation. If there was an active presence in the castle, everything he had discovered ceased to be just history. It became living evidence. With extreme care, he moved to the office door and opened it just a crack. The hallway was dark, but not empty. A silhouette was positioned near the end of the corridor, partially obscured by the darkness. It was tall, motionless, with a posture that didn't seem natural. There was no clear movement, but there was a presence, undeniable. Daniel tried to adjust his vision, forcing his eyes to adapt to the low light. It was then that he noticed a detail that made his stomach churn. The silhouette was facing directly at him, as if he knew exactly where he was. Silence returned to the room, but now it was heavy with an almost palpable tension. Neither of them moved. No further sounds were made. Then slowly the figure tilted its head, a simple gesture, but profoundly wrong. Daniel took a step back, his heart racing uncontrollably. This was no ordinary intruder. There was something about that presence that didn't fit any logical pattern. And, for the first time since entering the castle, he considered the possibility that he wasn't dealing with just a forgotten crime, but with something that should never have been discovered. Daniel didn't wait to see if the figure would move first. Instinct finally overcame curiosity, and he slowly retreated into the office, closing the door silently. His heart was pounding, and each beat seemed to echo through the silent room. He needed to think, but time was running out. Outside, the sound returned. Steps. This time closer than ever, more defined. The wooden floor of the hallway creaked under the weight of something that wasn't moving in haste, but with purpose. There was no hesitation in that walk. It wasn't someone lost. It was someone, or something, that knew the space. Daniel looked around quickly, searching for any way out. The office window seemed like an option, but as he approached, he realized it was locked from the inside with an old iron frame. Forcing it would make noise. Noise meant exposure. The footsteps stopped right on the other side of the door. Silence. So, a light touch, not a hit. A dragging touch, as if fingers were slowly tracing the surface of the wood. Daniel held his breath. The ringing continued, rising from the height of the doorknob to almost the top of the door, tracing an irregular path. Then it stopped abruptly. The doorknob turned, slowly, but it didn't open, as if something were being tested. Daniel took another step back, gripping the camera tightly. His mind tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps it was a homeless person, someone using the castle as shelter. But nothing about that behavior seemed human enough to support that explanation. Suddenly the sound stopped. The footsteps returned, now receding down the hallway. Daniel remained motionless for several long seconds, waiting for some new sign. Nothing. Silence returned, but it was no longer the same as before. Now there was anticipation, as if the castle were simply waiting for the next move. He couldn't stay there. Carefully, he opened the door again, this time faster, determined not to lose the initiative. The hallway was empty, but something had changed. Marks on the floor, faint but visible in the dust. Traces. These were no ordinary footprints. They were uneven, as if the weight was distributed incorrectly, creating a distorted pattern. In some places, they looked like dragging, as if a part of the body wasn't being lifted completely off the ground. Daniel followed the tracks. Each step he took led him deeper into the castle wing, away from the staircase. The walls grew narrower, the lighting non-existent. He had to use his flashlight again, now with less concern for being discreet. If there was something there, it already knew of his presence. The tracks led to a door at the end of the corridor. Unlike the others, this one was reinforced with additional metal plates, attached in an improvised manner. It wasn't part of the original construction. It was an adaptation, a containment measure. Daniel hesitated for a moment, but investigative logic prevailed. He approached and touched the surface of the door. Cold, dense, heavy. When he tried to turn the doorknob, he realized it was unlocked. That didn't make sense. A reinforced structure. Open? He pushed. The door revealed a narrow, steep descending staircase leading to a lower level of the castle that was not visible from the outside. The air rising from there was different, denser, more humid, laden with the same organic odor he had smelled at the entrance, but much more intense. Daniel went downstairs. Each step produced a muffled sound, as if the environment absorbed the noise. The stone walls were more worn, marked by deep scratches and dark stains that could not be attributed solely to time. Upon reaching the bottom of the stairs, he found an underground corridor. There, the castle revealed its true nature. The walls were undecorated. There was no furniture, only doors. Several of them lined up on both sides, all made of metal, with small rectangular openings at eye level. Aim. Daniel approached the first one. When he shone the light inside through the opening, he saw only darkness and something on the floor, a small object. He strained his eyes. A shoe. Children's. His stomach clenched. He went to the next cell. This time there was more. Torn fabrics, marks on the interior walls, deep scratches indicating desperate attempts to escape. Some cells had inscriptions, numbers repeatedly scratched out, like a count of days. That was not just a place of confinement. It was a system, an operation, and Eleanor was at the center of it all. As he moved forward, Daniel began to notice an even more disturbing pattern. Some cells were open, not broken into, just open, empty. But they haven't been abandoned for very long. The air there still held a presence, recent life. He reached the end of the corridor. The last door was different, bigger, no observation hatch, completely closed, and there was something about her, deep marks, concentrated on the inside, as if something extremely strong had tried to get out. Repeatedly. Daniel approached slowly. He placed his hand on the surface, and then he listened. Breathing, low, irregular, coming from the other side. His entire body froze. That wasn't an echo. It wasn't imagination. There was something inside, something alive. Before he could react, a violent impact struck the door from the inside. Daniel instinctively recoiled. Another impact, stronger. The metal structure vibrated, producing a deep sound that echoed throughout the corridor. And then, for the first time, a clear sound came. A voice, but distorted, dragged, almost unrecognizable. You shouldn't have come." The silence that followed was even worse, because this time Daniel was absolutely certain of one thing. He was no longer investigating a crime. He had entered into something that was still happening. Daniel remained motionless for a few seconds after the voice echoed behind the reinforced door. The impact still vibrated in the metal structure, but the silence that followed seemed more threatening than the noise itself. He knew that this moment demanded an immediate decision: retreat and preserve what he had already discovered, or advance and risk not getting out of there. The choice came almost automatically. He needed to understand. The breathing on the other side continued, irregular but now more controlled, as if the presence inside had realized it no longer needed to force its way out. Daniel approached again, this time positioning his ear close to the cold surface of the door. "Who's there?" Her voice came out low, restrained but firm. For a few seconds there was no response. Then a faint sound of internal movement, followed by something unexpected, a short laugh, dry, without emotion. "Too late," the voice replied, still distorted, as if it were difficult to articulate the words. "He already knows." Daniel frowned. Him. That changed everything. Before he could ask any more questions, a distant noise traveled down the underground corridor, coming from the stairwell. A dry, repetitive sound, like something lightly touching the stone as it descended. It wasn't the wind. Daniel turned around slowly. The feeling of being watched returned with intensity. The narrow space of the corridor, with its open and closed cells, now seemed less abandoned and more active. He needed to get out of there, at least for now. But before going upstairs, something caught his eye on the wall next to the last cell. Unlike the others, there was an area there partially covered in accumulated dirt. Not ordinary dust, but a thicker layer, as if it had been deliberately used to hide something. Daniel reached out his hand. The surface revealed inscriptions, symbols. They weren't random. There was repetition, a pattern, an organization that resembled language or code. Some of them matched those he had seen in the documents from Eleanor's office. That connected everything. She wasn't just confining people, she was recording something through them, testing, observing, cataloging. The staircase began to emit that dragging sound again, closer now. With no time for a full analysis, Daniel pulled out his camera and quickly recorded the inscriptions. Every second there increased the risk. He needed to take this information outside, cross-reference the data, and understand what was really going on in that place. As he stepped away from the wall, he noticed another detail, almost imperceptible. A small object trapped between the stones on the ground. He bent down. It was a pendant, old but well preserved. Turning it over under the light of a flashlight, he found an inscription on the back. Initials, and a date. The initials matched one of the names in the employee register. But the date was too recent, very recent. That meant that someone from that old record was still there not long ago, or worse, it was still there. The sound of the staircase stopped abruptly. Daniel held his breath. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy, expectant, as if something had stopped on purpose, listening, waiting. He didn't hesitate any longer. He turned and began to climb the steps with controlled speed, avoiding running, but not wasting time. Each step seemed to echo louder than it should. The air became less dense as he climbed, but the feeling of being pursued intensified. When he finally reached the top of the stairs, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The door leading to the second-floor hallway was open. He was certain he had only left it leaning against the wall. Now it was completely out in the open. Daniel walked slowly back across the street, returning to the main corridor. Everything seemed the same, but it wasn't. The markings on the ground had changed. Previously, they followed a single direction. Now they were scattered, as if something had circulated throughout the entire floor. He moved forward cautiously, looking around, trying to spot any movement. The office remained open, exactly as he had left it. But as he approached, he noticed that the papers on the desk were no longer in the same position. Someone had been messing with them, and there wasn't enough time for that to be a coincidence. He rushed into the office and checked the documents. Some were missing, others were upside down, as if they had been reviewed urgently. This meant only one thing. He was no longer passively alone in that space. There was interaction, there was an answer, and even more worryingly, there was intelligence. Before he could react, a sound came from behind him. Not in the hallway, inside the office itself. A slight crackling sound coming from the darkest corner of the room. Daniel turned slowly, raising the flashlight. The light traveled along the wall, down to the floor, and then stopped. There was something there, a brand, fresh, designed directly on the wood, one of the symbols he had seen underground, but that one was incomplete, as if it had been interrupted or left that way on purpose. The message was clear, even without words. That wasn't just an old record, it was a dialogue. And someone, or something, had just responded to his presence. The incomplete symbol on the wood seemed to pulse under the lantern's light, not from actual movement, but from the way Daniel's mind was trying to comprehend it. It wasn't just a mark, it was a direct response to his presence. There was no longer any doubt. The castle was reacting, and someone inside him too. Daniel slowly approached the newly made mark, analyzing each stroke. The final interrupted line seemed to have been left there on purpose. It wasn't carelessness, it was an invitation or a warning. Her mind began to connect the dots, the records in the office, the underground cells, the repeated symbols, the voice behind the door, and now this. Eleanor wasn't just conducting physical experiments. There was something deeper. Something involving language, communication, perhaps even an attempt to make contact with something that shouldn't be understood. Before he could organize his thoughts more clearly, the camera in his hand emitted a slight noise. She called herself. Daniel froze. The screen lit up, partially illuminating the surroundings with a cold glow. He hadn't pressed anything. Slowly, he turned the device towards himself. The screen showed that recording was active, but I wasn't grasping what was ahead. I was displaying something else, another environment, the same office, but different, darker, more deteriorated. And in the center of the image, there was a figure, stop, property, looking directly at the camera. Daniel instinctively looked up, pointing the flashlight at the same spot. Nothing. The space was empty. He turned his eyes back to the display. The figure was still there, closer. A chill ran down his spine. This wasn't a technical glitch, it was interference. Something was using the equipment as a means of display, or of getting closer. The figure began to move on the screen, slowly. Moving forward, but in the real world, the environment remained still. Daniel took a step back, trying to turn off the camera, but the buttons didn't respond. The image flickered for a moment, and then something happened that completely defied any possibility of logical explanation. The figure on the screen raised its arm, and he pointed, directly behind Daniel. He didn't turn around immediately. His body froze, torn between the urge to react and the fear of what he would find. His breathing became irregular and heavy, while the overwhelming sensation of presence intensified. Then he listened, a whisper, very close, almost pressed against her ear. "Now, you see," Daniel turned sharply. The flashlight illuminated the space behind him, and this time it wasn't empty. The figure was there, tall, thin, with slightly distorted proportions, as if her body didn't completely conform to human structures. Her skin, or what remained of it, seemed stretched too tightly, marked by cracks and dark spots. Her face was the most disturbing part. The eyes were missing, not empty, but removed. Like in portraits, like in the brands, like everything else in that castle, the connection was immediate. That wasn't random. It was standard. It was replication. Daniel stepped back quickly, knocking some of the papers off the table. The figure didn't move. It remained motionless, only tilting its head slightly, the same gesture he had seen in the hallway. But now, up close, the movement was even more wrong, misaligned, as if he were imitating something he didn't fully understand. "Eleanor!" The voice came out almost involuntarily. The figure reacted. A slight tremor ran through his body, and then, for the first time, there was a clear answer. "No more." The voice wasn't coming from my mouth. It came from within. From an undefined point in space, Daniel felt the weight of that revelation hit him brutally. That wasn't Eleanor, but it wasn't something entirely different either. It was the result, something created, something transformed. Her mind immediately returned to her office notes, observations, tests, reactions, resistance. Eleanor wasn't just studying people, she was trying to change something about them. And somehow, he succeeded. The sound of another impact echoed in the distance, coming from underground, stronger, more violent, as if the presence in the last cell were reacting. The figure in front of him tilted its head again, but this time more abruptly, unstable, as if he were losing control. "He is waking up." Daniel felt the air in the room become almost unbearably heavy. He, again. But now, with a much clearer meaning. What was in the cells? What Eleanor had created? It wasn't the final stage. It was just part of something bigger, and that something was still active. It was still evolving. It was still there. Without warning, the figure before him took a step back and vanished into the darkness of the corridor, as if it had never been there. The camera in his hand turned off. Silence returned. But now, burdened with an irreversible certainty, the castle was not the scene of the crime. It was the laboratory, and the true danger had not yet been fully revealed. The silence that followed the apparition brought no relief. On the contrary, it made the atmosphere even more oppressive, as if the entire castle had adjusted to the new reality. Daniel was now part of it, not as an observer, but as an element embedded in the system. He stood still for a few moments, trying to reorganize his thoughts, but each attempt stumbled upon the same inevitable conclusion. This could no longer be treated as a routine investigation. There was no longer any distance between him and what was happening there. He was inside, and something knew this. The impact from underground echoed again, more intense, more frequent. The castle's structure seemed to absorb the blows, but not without reacting. Small particles of dust began to fall from the ceiling, revealing the force coming from below. Daniel looked at the office door, then down the hallway. He needed to leave. But he couldn't leave without concrete proof. The camera footage, the documents, the symbols, all of that needed to be taken outside. Otherwise, that story would die there, just like all the others. He quickly began gathering the most important papers from the table, folding them and putting them in his backpack. His hands still trembled slightly, but his focus had returned. The survival instinct now mingled with the need to expose the truth. As he turned to leave, he noticed something new. The unfinished symbol on the wall had been completed. Daniel stopped. He was absolutely certain that seconds before that mark had been interrupted. Now the finish line was there, complete, perfect. And there was something more, a second, smaller symbol next to the first. He was not being passively observed. It was being included. The understanding came as a cold shock. That wasn't just communication. It was a record. He was now part of the norm. The sound, coming from underground, intensified, followed by something different, a prolonged metallic noise, as if a structure were giving way under pressure. The last cell. Daniel didn't need to go downstairs to confirm. He knew. The thing down there was coming out. Without wasting any more time, he hurried down the corridor toward the main staircase. His steps were now quick, without any concern for noise. His priorities had completely changed. But as he reached the stairs, something made him stop abruptly. The marks on the floor. They were no longer scattered randomly. They formed a pattern. One direction. Going up. What was underground was no longer there. I was coming. Daniel climbed the stairs quickly, his heart racing. Every second was now crucial. Upon reaching the ground floor, the atmosphere felt different, not physically, but in sensation. The air was heavier, warmer, as if the castle were breathing. He crossed the main hall, passing the dark stain on the floor again, but this time something had changed. The stain was no longer dry. There was a damp sheen on the surface. Recent. Daniel immediately looked away, refusing to process it at that moment. The main door was right ahead, the exit. He accelerated, but before he could reach her, a sound came from behind him. No steps. Something denser, dragged, irregular. Like several movements occurring at the same time, but without perfect coordination. Daniel stopped. Against all logic, he turned slowly. The darkness at the back of the hall seemed deeper than before, almost solid. And then something began to emerge from it. Not a defined form, but parts, disconnected movements that little by little began to organize themselves. Arms, or what appeared to be arms, members that did not follow natural proportions. The structure was unstable, as if it were constantly being rebuilt, but what really made Daniel understand the gravity of the situation were the faces, fragments of faces, partially formed, some without eyes, others with distorted features. It's as if multiple identities are being superimposed onto a single entity. That was not an isolated creature. Era, a soma, the result of everything that had happened in that place, every disappearance, each experiment, each record. Everything culminating in that. The entity moved a little further, producing a low sound, almost like a failed attempt at speech. The overlapping voices created an incomprehensible noise, but one laden with intention. Daniel took a step back. The door was just a few meters away, but something inside him understood that this wouldn't simply end with an escape, because it wasn't confined to the castle. That was connected to the process. And the process now included him. The organization stopped for a moment, and then all faces turned toward Daniel simultaneously. The air seemed to compress around them, and amidst the chaos of overlapping voices, a sentence began to form, slow, drawn out, but comprehensible. You also belong. Daniel gripped the doorknob. But it didn't open, because at that moment he realized something even more disturbing than the entity before him. The fear was no longer just of dying there. It was time to leave and take that with him. Daniel's hand remained firmly on the doorknob, but his mind no longer reacted with the same impulse to flee. Something had changed within him, not just fear, but a brutal understanding of what he faced. To run meant to scatter. To deny meant to allow the cycle to continue. And for the first time since entering the castle, he stopped acting like someone who wanted to escape, and began acting like someone who needed to stop it. The entity before him was not moving forward. I was expecting it, as if acknowledging this change. The fragmented faces remained turned toward him, motionless, but filled with an almost conscious attention. Daniel took a deep breath, forcing control over his own body. His eyes quickly scanned the room, analyzing possibilities, not of escape, but of action. The standard. Everything there revolved around patterns, the symbols, the records, the repetitions. Eleanor hadn't created something chaotic. She had followed a logic, a method. That meant that even in the final deformity, structure still existed, and the structure could be interrupted. The memory of the symbol in the office came rushing back, incomplete, then finished, and then duplicated. That wasn't just communication, it was progression. Daniel slowly released the doorknob. The entity reacted with a slight, almost imperceptible shift, as if it had perceived the decision. "You don't want me to leave," he said in a low, controlled voice. The sound echoed through the hall. For a brief moment, the overlapping voices of the entity ceased. Silence. Then, a subtle movement ran through its unstable form. Confirmation. Daniel nodded slightly, more to himself than to what was in front of him. The logic was beginning to form more clearly now. It wasn't trying to stop him from leaving on a predatory impulse. I was protecting something. The process, the cycle. And if he left without understanding, everything would continue. Daniel took a step away from the door. The entity did not move forward. He simply observed. "Then you need me," he continued, now more firmly. This time, there was an immediate reaction. The faces began to move in a disordered way, as if trying to reorganize themselves. A low sound emerged, less chaotic than before, almost focused. Daniel realized. That was trying to communicate more clearly. But I couldn't. Because it was fragmented, Eleanor had created something powerful, but unstable, incomplete. And that's when the final piece began to fall into place in Daniel's mind. The symbol, the record, inclusion. He hadn't been marked by chance. He had been integrated because it was necessary, not as a victim, but as a continuation. The impact of this realization was immediate and dangerous. For a second, his mind tried to reject the idea, but the logic was irrefutable. All previous records involved people confined, tested, fragmented, but he was conscious, able to understand the pattern, capable of completing what had been started. "Eleanor isn't finished," he said, almost as if it were a verbalized thought. The organization reacted violently, its form distorted for a moment, as if that statement had touched something central. The voices emerged again, more intense, but now with comprehensible fragments. "No, complete. Failure. It needs..." Daniel took another step forward. This time he was the one who made the first move. The fear was still there, but now controlled, directed. He no longer saw it merely as a threat, but as a broken system, something that needed to be ended or destroyed before it expanded beyond that place. "I saw the symbols," he said. "I understood the pattern." The entity began to retreat slightly, not out of fear, but for an answer. "You can't finish this alone," Daniel continued. "That's why you brought me here." Silence. A different kind of silence. Heavy, concordant. The truth had been established. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, organizing his final thoughts. There were only two possibilities: complete the process, risking becoming a permanent part of it, or interrupt it, possibly destroying everything, including any chance of fully understanding what Eleanor had created. But there was something more important than understanding. There were consequences. He opened his eyes again, more decisive. "I'm not going to continue this," he stated. The reaction was immediate. The entity advanced abruptly, not through direct attack but through structural collapse. Its form began to unravel and recompose simultaneously, as if it were rapidly losing stability. The voices became chaotic again, out of control. The entire environment seemed to react. The walls creaking, the floor vibrating slightly, as if the castle itself were connected to that structure. Daniel understood. His choice was not merely symbolic. She affected everything. He turned quickly and ran back to the underground staircase. If there was a point of origin, it was down there. If there was a way to interrupt it, it would be there too. Behind him, the sound of the entity intensified, but it didn't follow him directly. It was as if he were trapped in his own instability, unable to remain cohesive for long outside the center of the process. Daniel descended the steps quickly, ignoring the risk of falling. Upon reaching the cell corridor, he immediately realized that something had changed. The doors, they were all open. It's on, heavier than ever. But now there was something new, a collective sound. Breaths, multiple, irregular, coming from all directions. Daniel didn't stop. He went straight to the last cell, the largest, the most heavily marked, the source of the previous impact. The door was open, wide open, and inside there was no darkness. There was movement. Daniel stopped at the entrance to the open cell, his body on high alert, but his mind functioning with unusual clarity. The fear was still there, but it had been displaced by something stronger. Urgency. This had to end, right there. The inside of the cell was no longer a space of confinement. It was the center. The walls were completely covered with the symbols he had seen throughout the castle, no longer fragmented, but organized in a continuous pattern, covering every inch of stone. There was no empty space. There was no interruption. It was as if the entire system converged on that point. In the center of the room, the floor had a different structure. It wasn't just stone. There was a deeply carved circular mark, with the same symbols arranged in concentric layers. In the middle, a darkened area, as if something had been repeatedly deposited there over time. Daniel didn't need any more proof. That was the core of the process, the place where it all began, and where it all ended. The sound of breathing intensified around them. It wasn't just coming from the open cells, but now also from the surrounding environment, as if the air were heavy with presence. He wasn't alone down there. He never had been, but for the first time that didn't paralyze him. He moved forward. Each step he took inside the cell seemed to generate an invisible reaction. Breaths wavered, the sounds around him adjusted, as if the entire environment were responding to his proximity to the center. Daniel took the camera out of his backpack and placed it on the ground, pointed at the circle. If it didn't move from there, at least it needed to be found. There needed to be a record of it. As he got closer, he noticed a crucial detail. There were marks on the floor, recent ones, footprints. But they weren't like the ones in the hallway. They were more defined. Humanities. That meant someone had been there recently, someone who still had form. Before he could delve deeper into the thought, a subtle movement appeared before him. In the center of the circle, something began to emerge from the darkened area, not like the salon entity. That was different, more stable, more complete. The form rose slowly, as if being reconstructed from within the symbol itself. First the limbs, then the torso, then the face. Daniel held his breath. He acknowledged it. Even with the alterations, even with the subtle distortions, there was something unmistakable. It was Eleanor, or what was left of it. Unlike the other manifestations, this one didn't seem fragmented. There was control in the movements, a clear intention in every gesture. When it finally rose completely, its eyes, unlike the other forms, were present, but they weren't normal. They were opaque, not very deep, as if they weren't reflecting at all. She looked directly at Daniel, and for the first time, there was no distortion in the voice. "You took too long." The sentence was spoken calmly, effortless, noiseless. Daniel didn't answer immediately. His focus was on every detail, the posture, the stability, the difference between that figure and everything he had seen until then. "You're not like the others," she continued, stepping outside the circle. "You understand." The air around them seemed to compress. The breathing stopped abruptly, total silence. Daniel took a step to the side, keeping his distance, but without retreating completely. "You created this," he said firmly. She tilted her head slightly, observing him with almost clinical attention. "I started," he replied, "but I didn't finish." The confirmation came without hesitation, without guilt, without emotion. "That thing up there," Daniel continued, "isn't you." "No," she replied. "That's what happens when the process fails." A slight tremor ran through the cell walls. Not violent, but constant, like a warning. And here, Daniel asked, looking around. Eleanor slowly opened her arms, indicating the space. This is where it works. The implication was immediate. That was no mere experiment. It was an active system, and contrary to what he had thought, he wasn't completely out of control. She took another step forward. You saw the symbols. You understood the pattern. You were integrated without being broken. Daniel felt the weight of those words intensely. She wasn't describing it. I was evaluating. You need me, he said. A slight smile appeared on his face. Cold. Necessary. No, she replied. I've been waiting for someone like you. The sound from the hallway returned. More intense, closer. The fragmented entity was descending. Daniel could feel the vibration in the floor. Time was up. Eleanor glanced quickly toward the cell entrance, and then looked back at him. You have a choice, he said, with the same calmness. End it, or watch it all fall apart. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on her. Tensions were reaching their peak, because now there was no more doubt. There was no further investigation. There was a decision, and any choice would have irreversible consequences. The sound coming from the corridor was no longer distant. It was imminent. The underground structure vibrated with the approach of the fragmented entity, as if the castle itself were reacting to the inevitable collision between two states of the same process, the incomplete and the final. Daniel kept his eyes fixed on Eleanor. There was no more room for doubt. The choice needed to be made now. If I finish this, he said, his voice firm despite the overwhelming pressure around him, what happens to me? Eleanor did not hesitate. You cease to be just you. The answer was clear, direct, without any attempt to soften the reality. The impact was immediate, but Daniel did not back down. What if I do nothing? A new tremor ran through the ground, stronger. The sound in the hallway intensified, now accompanied by that chaotic noise of overlapping voices. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Then it goes up, she said. And continues. The simplicity of the response was more frightening than any threat. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. Everything was converging towards that moment. The investigation, the records, the victims, the brands. None of that was in the past. It was continuity, and he was now the deciding factor. When he opened his eyes again, there was something different in his expression. It wasn't an absence of fear, it was a choice. He took a step toward the circle. Eleanor didn't move. He simply observed. You were wrong, Daniel said as he stepped forward. It wasn't about completing it. She frowned slightly, for the first time showing something close to an emotional reaction. It was about control, he continued. The sound of the fragmented entity reached the cell entrance. The presence was overwhelming. The unstable form began to emerge at the edge of vision, occupying the space with its distorted limbs and overlapping faces. But Daniel did not turn away. He entered the circle. The instant he crossed the center line, the entire environment reacted. The symbols on the walls began to vibrate, as if responding directly to his presence. The air became dense, almost solid, pressing against his body. Eleanor stepped forward. For the first time, there was urgency in his movements. Don't do that without understanding, she said now intensely. You don't know what you're interrupting. Daniel looked directly at her. I know exactly. He bent down and ran his hand over the darkened area in the center of the circle. The surface wasn't just stained, it was layered. Repetitions, physical records of everything that had been done there. The standard, a base, the origin. The sound behind him grew abruptly. The fragmented entity moved into the cell, its form colliding with the space, distorting the surrounding environment. The voices intensified, trying to form words, trying to interfere. Eleanor turned slightly, assessing the approach. You can't stop it, she said now more sternly. You can only finish it. Daniel ignored it. His eyes scanned the symbols on the floor, searching for coherence, flaw, rupture. And then he saw. An imperfection, small, almost invisible, but present. One of the central symbols was incomplete, not like the one in the office, but structurally incomplete. That was not a mistake, it was the limit. He stood up slowly. The entity was already inside the cell, occupying a large part of the space, its faces turned towards him, its voices overlapping in a desperate attempt to communicate. Eleanor realized. "No," he said, for the first time with something close to real tension. Daniel looked at her. "You never finished, because it wasn't meant to be finished." The silence that followed was instantaneous. Even with the entity present, even with the chaos all around, there was an absolute pause. As if the system itself had acknowledged that statement, Daniel placed his foot on the incomplete symbol, and he pressed. The effect was immediate. A deep sound echoed through the room, like something being forced out of alignment. The markings on the floor began to distort, not visually but structurally, as if the logic that supported them was being broken. Eleanor moved forward quickly. "You're going to destroy everything," he said, his voice now uncontrolled. Daniel kept up the pressure. Exactly. The fragmented entity reacted violently. Its form began to collapse, not in attack, but in disintegration. Faces dissolved, voices fragmented into disjointed noises. The entire castle began to shake. The cell walls cracked. The symbols on the surfaces began to disappear one by one, as if they had never been there. Eleanor stopped. Property, observing. For the first time, there was something clear in his face. Not anger, not fear, but understanding belatedly. "You chose the end," she said, almost in a whisper. Daniel did not answer. He simply kept his foot pressed down, even as the ground gave way beneath him, even as the environment collapsed. The entity released one last collective sound, not of threat, but of rupture. And then, silence. Total, abrupt. The weight in the air disappeared, the pressure subsided, the environment reverted to an inert state. Daniel remained motionless for a few seconds, waiting for any reaction. Nothing. He looked around. The walls were clean, without symbols, no marks. The cell was just a cell. Empty. Eleanor was still there, but different. The shape now appeared unstable, almost translucent. She looked at him one last time. "You'll never know," she said, her voice already breaking. "What could have been?" Daniel held her gaze. "Neither you." And then she disappeared, noiseless, without a trace. Daniel remained alone, but not for long, because by taking a step back, the silence was not complete. Something. "I am a hunter," very low, almost imperceptible, coming from within him. Daniel left the underground without haste, but also without looking back. Each step he climbed seemed lighter than the one he descended, as if the castle itself had lost the invisible weight that supported it. The air was no longer dense. There was no longer that artificial silence, only the natural sound of the ancient structure reacting to time. When he reached the ground floor, the main hall seemed ordinary. The stain on the floor had disappeared. The walls no longer conveyed a sense of constant surveillance. Everything that once seemed full of meaning was now just ruin. But Daniel knew that this did not mean that nothing had happened. It simply meant that there were no more visible traces. He walked slowly across the hall, observing every detail, trying to identify any residual sign of what he had witnessed. Nothing. No symbols, no marks, no traces. It was as if the castle had been restarted. The main door was still open. He left. The cold night air hit his face like a shock of reality. The surrounding hills remained silent, but now that silence no longer seemed imposed. It was simply a natural absence of movement. Daniel walked to the car without hesitation. He went in. He started the engine, but it didn't start immediately. His hands rested motionless on the steering wheel. The mind, however, was still inside, reorganizing, reassessing. trying to understand what in fact had been ended. After a few seconds, he picked up the camera from the seat next to him. He called. The screen lit up normally. He accessed the recordings. There were files, several, but when opening them, nothing. The images were empty. No content. I am here, without any record of what happened inside. Daniel frowned, navigating through the files with increasing speed. Everything had been erased, or it was never registered. He let out a soft sigh, resting his head on the back of the seat. That changed everything. Without evidence, history does not exist. Without records, there was no way to expose them. Everything that remained was in him, and that was a problem. He put the camera aside and finally started the car. The road ahead was empty, lit only by the headlights. As he drove away, the castle disappeared in the rearview mirror, becoming just a distant silhouette, smaller and smaller, until it vanished completely. The return trip was silent. No attempt to organize thoughts, no immediate conclusions, just the lingering feeling that something had been interrupted, but not fully understood. Days later, back in the city, Daniel tried to reconstruct the narrative based on his memory. Notes were taken, lines of reasoning organized, connections established. But everything seemed incomplete. Something was missing. There was always something missing, as if an essential part of the experience had been removed, not erased, but inaccessible. He tried to go back to the old records, the newspaper article that led him to the castle. Missing, the public files on Eleanor Whitmore, non-existent. It was as if all of history had been erased from official reality, but not from him. The nights began to change. Sleep became irregular, interrupted, and at times replaced by something that didn't seem exactly like a dream. They were fragments, quick images, symbols, lines, standards, always incomplete, almost always understandable. Daniel began to realize that his mind wasn't just remembering. I was trying to keep going. The first time he woke up with his heart racing, it took him a few seconds to understand what had happened. His right hand was scarred, slightly, almost imperceptible. Masali, a line, until, curved. It wasn't a cut. It wasn't a wound. It was a drawing. He ran to the mirror. He observed carefully. And then he recognized it. It was part of a symbol, incomplete, exactly like what I had seen in the castle. Daniel stepped back slowly, his gaze fixed on his own hand. His breathing became heavy. The mind tried to deny it, but he couldn't, because the truth was already too clear to ignore. He had interrupted the process. Try. But it wasn't all over yet, because the system was never just in the castle. He always needed continuity. And now, she was in it. Daniel closed his hand slowly, as if one could hide that, as if it could be prevented, but deep down he already knew. That wasn't the end. It was just a new way to begin. Months later, the castle no longer existed in the official records. Where there had once been an isolated structure nestled among hills, now only an empty plot of land remained, as if nothing had ever been built there. No documentation, no mention, no physical trace. But in a small apartment, far from that place, Daniel remained silent before a table covered with handwritten sheets of paper. Symbols, hundreds of them. Some complete, others don't. His hand moved slowly, almost without hesitation, tracing yet another line with increasing precision. His gaze was fixed, devoid of doubt. And before stopping, he murmured something almost inaudible. Now it makes sense. On the surface of the last leaf, the symbol was finally completed. And for the first time, he smiled. And now, I have a question for you. If you were in Daniel's place, would you have made the same choice? Would you have the courage to interrupt something you don't fully understand? Or would you risk finishing the process, even without knowing what it might turn you into? Stories like this don't just end when they're over. They linger in the mind, expanding into possibilities and raising questions we don't always want to answer. If this story has captivated you so far, Share it with someone who also enjoys intense mysteries and stories that leave a lasting impression. And tell me in the comments, do you think Daniel really destroyed everything? Or did he just change the course of something much bigger? Because sometimes the real terror isn't in what we see, but what continues even after the end.